I love sport.
Well, to be fair, not all sports.
I like exciting sports.
Basketball. Boxing. MMA.
And that's pretty much it.
I guess it's fair to say I like some sports.
And the sport that's grabbed my attention most recently has been MMA.
Hell, it's even gotten to the point where I started training jiu-jitsu myself, despite having no athletic talent. But why? Why am I so attracted to MMA?
Is it some caveman monkey part of my brain that's attracted to violent action?
Or is it an appreciation of watching top athletes in their prime duke it out to see who's on top? Or maybe it's the fascination of watching a high-level chess match with crazy consequences, where one small slip-up can mean you being separated from your consciousness.
I don't really know, but what I do know is I'm a fan.
And as a fan, I find myself between a rock and a hard place.
Watching the sport I love, but increasingly becoming aware of the consequences of sustained head trauma.
Concussion, CTE, head trauma, TBI, subconcussive blows.
Lack of impulse control, dementia, violent actions, thoughts of suicide. All very real problems with very real consequences. So, as a fascinated fan, I'm going to set out to learn as much as I can about head trauma and contact sports, and see if there's a brighter future for the sports I love.
My name is David Beaver. I run a company called Bay Medics.
Considered one of the best medical providers for MMA events in New Zealand, Bay Medics is run by Dave Beaver. They've been helping the fight community for over 20 years. I sat down with Dave to talk about how MMA is run in this country.
Some of the promoters will require their fighters to get a doctor's clearance first, and most of the promoters now will require their fighters to get blood tests done. And then we run basically a free-phase pre-fight check. We sit down and talk with the person about prior history, fight history, medical history, allergies, medications, etc. We then go for a few diagnostics, blood pressure, SpO2, make sure everything's working, and then finally a range of motion check. So when they go into the ring, we've got a pretty good understanding that they're safe to be in there. If they're able to move, they're able to function. Our biggest concern probably is head trauma, from whether it's in the early stages or later stages. It's obviously a sport of contact, so people hit each other in the head all the time, kick each other in the head, and in some cases elbow each other in the head. So we're very careful about that, and unfortunately it's one of the things we can't always check as well as we can a break, for example.
A concussion is another way of another name for what we call a mild traumatic brain injury.
This is Bryan Chong, a doctor who focuses on occupational and sports medicine. I went down to talk to him about concussion in sports.
Concussion is quite relatively poorly understood, and it's something that has the potential for quite significant both short as well as long-term effects for patient health and patient outcomes, as well as overall well-being and quality of life. Poorly treated and poorly identified head injury and concussion has the potential to exacerbate and make illnesses due to repeated injury and insult from not resting and not allowing the body to heal. And we see that a lot with combat sports injuries, where athletes are subjected to repeated injury and repeated trauma to the head without adequate rest and rehabilitation following a concussion.
Now, before we get too deep into things, I think it's important to break down some of the terminology. Something you're going to hear quite a bit about is CTE,
which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
It's a brain disease commonly diagnosed post-mortem in contact sports athletes. TBI stands for traumatic brain injury, and a subconcussion is when the brain takes damage from impacts, but the symptoms are less obvious. This becomes dangerous because a series of subconcussions can fly under the radar but do some serious damage to your long-term health. Huge controversies in the NFL have surrounded CTE. Some of its biggest stars post-career have been plagued by the disease. A lot is unknown about CTE, but a couple things are for sure. People who are exposed to head trauma over a long period of time are at risk, and there is no cure to CTE.
We're very lucky now as technology is sort of advanced. We've got a company in New Zealand now, HeadTech, that can actually bring gear to the fights and check for brain bleeds, cerebral bleeds. So if we have them at the fights, we know we've got another safety barrier in place.
Started looking into it to identify a couple of things. One of them that brain bleeds in sports were causes of death.
This is Vasco Kovačević, owner of HeadTech. I sat down with him to talk about the technology he uses to diagnose concussion.
With that, we looked into finding a piece of equipment that was portable and could be used to detect brain bleeds. Basically, we were detecting anyone going into the ring to see if they had a brain bleed before, and then straight after the fight, we were also doing that. While we discovered what the problem was, we actually started understanding that it's a much more complex problem than what we actually first looked into it. Yes, brain bleeds do cause deaths, but when it comes down to combat sports, majority of the time the person, if not all of the time, the person will have a concussion before the brain bleed occurs, if it is a trauma type of brain bleed.
I wanted to know if these risks are something athletes themselves consider when pursuing their career. So I went to the Combat Academy to talk with UFC star Dan Hooker.
I'm Dan Hooker. I'm 31 years old now. I've been fighting professionally since I was 19 years old.
Is something that, like the long-term and the short-term kind of effects of taking that damage something you personally consider when pursuing that career?
Pursuing the career, no, like I've committed to the sport like a very long time ago. Yeah, 12 years, 13 years, I was like, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to do for a living. So when you're, a bit younger and a bit more naive, you're just far less aware of what's going on, or far more like careless to it. I've been going to the same doctor my entire life, and he's been telling me I'm an idiot for a decade now. So it's definitely something that I know is dangerous. Yeah. I 100% aware. Limit it where I can, of course, and I'm definitely aware, and I research as much into concussions as I possibly can, and how to avoid them, how to mitigate the risk, how to work around it, how to make sure that you're fully recovered before you get back to training. So it's definitely something I take into account, but I'm definitely aware that it's an inherent risk that comes with competing at the level that I'm competing at.
One of the most important things to note, and this is something that I tell everyone, is that prevention is always better than cure. And whilst it sounds cliche, it really does ring true for things like mild traumatic brain injury or concussion, because following a head injury, the brain may not be able to return to its pre-injury state. And that's something that we find that can actually happen more often than not. No matter how much therapies and rehabilitation we do, there is a scope where if the brain is significantly injured enough, it's not going to return to its pre-baseline condition, and that's where appropriate health screening, appropriate surveillance, and appropriate preventative medicine is actually one of the best things we can see going forward.
An example of that screening is something that Vasco's doing with his HeadTech company.
We're developing what we're calling an athlete warrant of fitness, which would be a baseline test to do at the beginning of the season for rugby players, or beginning of the combat season as well for competent athletes, so that if anything does happen, we can actually start taking the ego of the fighters out and the guesswork out of everything, and just use actually up to state-of-the-art technology to have an identified line where someone is actually safe to come back to, or as we call a return to play. We were very happy to find that there was Dr. Bryan Chong that's joined us from Dr. 360 that had the same vision, but from a medical physician point of view. We have teamed up with him and managed to create a certain type, as we mentioned, athlete warranted fitness, which is full medical system.
So, a key part of the system and the surveillance around it is a machine called the iBox. Now, the way the iBox works is really interesting. Unlike CT scans, there's no radiation effects on your body. The user sits behind a screen and watches a small video as it moves from corner to corner. As this all happens, a sensor tracks your eyes at 500 frames per second and compiles the data on how well you were able to focus on the video. The results vary from 1 to 20, with anything above 10 being considered a concussion.
In reality, we're just taking out the guessing game. Up to now, a lot of concussions were a guessing game. And what we found out that professional athletes had something that we were calling subconcussions. It was very easy to hide because what we relied on was honesty and SCAT5, which is just a bunch of series of questions and observations that a person done that can be subjective.
It's quite, I guess, it's a bit ironic to say that we're talking about preventative medicine in a sport where the whole goal is to inflict trauma to the head and to various parts of the body. But with that being said, it can be done in a safe manner. And yes, there is always an argument that there is a risk of stripping the essence of the sport and the rawness and the way it used to be kind of thing. But I think that slowly there is a bit of a paradigm shift where we're starting to realize that the way it used to be is not the way it should be. Yeah. And there is a lot of scope to actually look after these fighters and look after these athletes while still providing a good platform for them to practice their code and for spectators to enjoy the sport in general.
TBI in contact sports is a problem, and it needs to be addressed, and probably addressed a little bit sooner than later. We really know that something needs to be done, and we believe that with the technology and the right doctors, we could make a protocol that should be utilised across the country.
Notice how Vasco said should be used. And that's because right now there's very little oversight on how MMA events are run in New Zealand.
The legislation pertaining to MMA is pretty much non-existent. There's a Boxing and Wrestling Act which was, I think, regulated and written in 1958, and as part of it, it says Asian martial arts are exempt from this legislation, so it's a bit of a loophole. So it's pretty loose. There is no overall governing body, there is no one sanctioning body run by the MMA community for their events, same as Thai boxing. So it's loose, it's what I consider to be well run and well policed and well governed, without having to look any further for assistance.
And what you're about to learn, as I did, is there's many different views and takes on this topic.
It's outdated. It is rubbish.
This is Terry Hill, president of the NZMMAF, which is basically the closest thing we have to a sanctioning body in New Zealand.
You get somebody getting knocked out in a boxing match, which happened in Auckland, and it was on national TV, and they turn up the next night to a kickboxing match in Tauranga and wanting to fight. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that Mark Craig, who's the #1 official in New Zealand, and he had seen the boxing match on TV the night before, recognised the fighter and refused to officiate. So he was withdrawn from the bout. But luckily for his own safety, there are no safety measures. And it needs to be well controlled and well structured.
You can say officially New Zealand's doesn't have it's not regulated, but it's self-regulated. It's a small community. I could name everyone in the community. If you just sat me here with a pen and paper, I'll write down the guys that started the sport in this country, the guys running the sport right now in this country, the guys putting on the biggest shows, the coaches in the country, like the top fighters. Like it is a small community, and I've just seen like over-regulation where you're bringing people from outside in to tick boxes like yes and no, black and white, this and that, just puts people at more danger, and you're taking away the experience of the people that are controlling the sport right now.
It's a very hard one. No one really has to listen to you. So if anyone that's created a small association chooses to say that, or to stick with the old motto, if it's not broken, don't fix it, which in reality, if we say that TBI or CTE in contact sports is not a problem, I think that is a problem itself. It's been visible that contact sports cause problems to us. We used to call it punch drunk for boxers. Now we're finding out that there's actually other medical terms that we could be using for that, and it's not just boxers, that it comes from many contacts, and that the rugby players probably suffer it more than anyone. It's a very hard one to be done in New Zealand. Everybody has to agree with it, and there's too many older type of views that are involved in some of the sports, which may not be the best way towards the future in some of the future sports. There is, I've always been told, there's many ways to skin a cat. So if that's the case, maybe the old way is not always the best way. I like it in some ways, but in some ways, some things do need to change with time.
20 years ago, there weren't medics at shows often, and you'd see people knocked out in the ring and dragged to their feet and taken back to the corner. Now it's very, very professional. There are medics at just about every show. For boxing, it has to be a regulated doctor. It has to be a medical doctor. Boxing registered. For any of those other shows that fall exempt under that legislation, it can be medics. And while it's not policed at the moment, the medics that do it are of a very high calibre and skill. So it's everyone has medics in place, which in my opinion is probably one of the most important things as far as safety goes. And the rest of it is self-governed. We don't have cowboys, because if a gym's not good and not going to do a good show, other gyms who are good won't provide them fighters, no show. So it is very self-governing, yeah.
So at the time of filming this, we're kind of at an interesting point across this journey that I've kind of gone on, and you're actually probably going to be the last person I interview, really delving into the state of regulation in MMA. And I've kind of brought this up with a few people I've interviewed along the way, and I've had like varying different views on the topic. Some people have kind of gone, oh, we're in a small market, we self-regulate. Gyms, any cowboys don't get given fighters because we all know who they are and we don't want to put our reputation on the line. But then there's also the other perspective of, it's a risky sport and things happen, and to have no consequences, kind of no liability, that's where a state of regulation could come in and kind of benefit. I kind of want to know your views on the whole situation.
The government should be overseeing this because it's a big problem. They look at the problem that it costs too much money to regulate, and we're not going to have anything to do with it. It's too much time and effort. It's not time and effort to the people within the industry who know what they're doing, but it does need to be paid for. We had three, I believe it was three, it might have even been more, within a 12-month period, corporate boxers die in the ring. So that was during the fight night. Now you imagine 3 All Blacks dying in rugby matches over a 12-month period. There would be a hue and cry over it. There would be a public outrage, and the sport would be pulled and looked at from every perspective. There would be government funding going into that, etc., etc. But corporate boxing, no. Why? Because it doesn't make them any money. That's simple. They don't care about it. To have these events regulated, that is, have a commission, a combat sports commission, that has people on the ground working these events. I'm not saying that it won't still go ahead, that the cowboy operators won't still operate. They will, but it'll be illegal. And that's the difference. So the police could then go in and shut it down. Right now, the police are hamstrung with what they can do about it under that Incompetent Wrestling and Boxing Act. And if that changes, and then you have a commission that can oversee and regulate it, then you will just have A, less deaths, B, less injury, C, all the correct protocols being followed, such as the right officials, the right medical teams.
It's complicated and clearly not a black and white topic. Very grey.
My personal gut instinct tells me, although what Terry proposes makes sense, and actually answers a lot of the concerns that other people have expressed about introducing regulation. Is it practical? Is it feasible that this can be introduced and done properly?
I don't know. I'm no expert, but I do think this is a conversation worth having.
I've learned a lot on this journey, and what makes me particularly hopeful is how open and helpful the community has been to me, just showing up with cameras and getting all this content. And I hope I've done that justice.
To an outsider, MMA might seem like a violent, vicious sport only for me hits. But on top of sharing information about head trauma and contact sports, I hope I've also shared an insight on how awesome the New Zealand fight community really is.
Also, if you're a bit like me and you kind of want to go deeper into learning about things, I'm going to release the full interviews this podcast, so delve into them and learn more about the topics. I don't really know how to end these things, so I'm just going to turn the camera off now.